Publishers and developers can face a lot of heat when they bring a franchise back from the dead, especially if it's been dead for a while, and the reaction tends to be even worse if the new version enters a new genre or appears to approach the world in a way different to the way fans are used to. Perhaps the most notable game of late that went through this excruciating process was Deus Ex Human Revolution, but there was a lesser known game that came out the next year that went through it as well, Syndicate, a reimagining of what was originally a tactical PC game. As happened in a rather similar situation with another tactical PC game, Fallout, fans of the original Syndicate were not happy when it was announced that the new Syndicate was going to be a modern first-person shooter featuring dubstep by Skrillex. But that's not where the similarities to the Human Revolution end. You've probably noticed by now, Syndicate bears a rather striking visual similarity to Human Revolution. Mechanically, however, they're quite different. Human Revolution's gunplay was something you resorted to when you had exhausted all other options. Your augmentations more often did the heavy lifting through sneaking around, slamming people into the ground, and whatever else. In fact, the use of augs and the use of guns feel like totally separate gameplay experience, with the gunplay suffering quite heavily in that particular comparison. Syndicate manages to meld the hacking aspects with the gunplay quite simply and elegantly. And yes, that means that the hacking elements are simplified, but it means that the shooter elements come out much better on the other end. It uses a system similar to the Gears of War active reload, where you're given the opportunity to influence the world around you, whether mechanical or human in nature. You can hit it early in the white spot, or you can let it fill all the way. But when you finish, you can make people commit suicide, turn on their enemies, or just ruin their gun. Figuring out how to maximize these abilities in combination with your weaponry makes for a very fun combat sandbox to play around in, while never making you feel like you're doing something the wrong way. Sometimes, perhaps too often, the game does come to rely too much on its shooting, and it's during these sequences that feel the most like a traditional first-person shooter that the game is at its worst. Syndicate shines when you're exploiting the weakness of your enemies and then shooting them, hacking them to turn their advantages into their weaknesses. When it's just transformed into a shooting gallery, Syndicate becomes the generic shooter that the fans of the original Syndicate were worried it was. But by the end of the game, with all the pieces of the gameplay puzzle in place, Syndicate really comes into its own, throwing you into combat arenas that allow you to play with all of your abilities and use them together with a huge selection of different weapons and environmental hazards to play exactly the way you want to. And it's exhilarating, but it doesn't last all that long. The biggest problem with Syndicate is that it spends too large of a portion of its overall runtime either teaching you how to play it or limiting what you can do with it. I'm not one to complain about a game being short, and that's something Syndicate definitely is at 4 hours. But I want to have that entire experience for that whole 4 hours. Spend maybe 10 minutes teaching me how to play and then let me loose. I don't want to just have the entire experience for 1 hour out of 4. And that, surprisingly enough, is where the co-op comes in. You don't come into most shooters thinking the co-op is where the best part of the game is, but sometimes it is. Perhaps the best example being Modern Warfare 2's Spec Ops missions. Nobody saw that coming. Syndicate's co-op missions take all the great things about the single player, strip away all the bullshit limitations that the game's constantly adding due to story reasons, and then it throws in 3 additional like-minded players to screw around in the sandbox with. Surprisingly enough, I didn't have much trouble finding people to play with, which is a continuous source of amazement on the Xbox 360. No matter what game I put in, I can find people to play with. And unlike a lot of other multiplayer games that have been out for years and years, this is one that's pretty easy to hop into. You might not be playing on the same level as your partners, but you'll still be able to help them out through healing and support from behind the front lines until you get a feel for the mechanics and a few upgrades, which doesn't take that long. Syndicate is a really fun ride with some fantastic gameplay mechanics in single player, but its co-op is where it really shines. If you can find people to play this with, which didn't seem to be a problem when I was reviewing it, it's extremely cheap to pick up a used copy of this game for the 360, somewhere between $5 and $10. I might be frustrated with some of the choices made in the single player level progression, how you're allowed to use your powers, and to be sure, the game does show a lot of potential that it thoroughly fails to deliver on. But the co-op experience in this game is one of the best I've ever played, and it's definitely worth it just for that. Every Friday, I look at games that were ignored when they came out or have been forgotten since. I look at games that people have forgotten ever even existed. Now, if there's a game like that you'd like me to take a look at, be sure to leave a comment below or send me a message. If you like this video, be sure to like it. And if you really like this video and want to see more like it, be sure to subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.